All right, we're going to take a brief sidestep here from working on our environment and sort of work on our environment a different way. We're going to just talk about lighting for a few minutes. Now, it's very common for me to kind of jump around and work on different things. For example, I work on the environment, then I'll work on the lighting a little bit. I think lighting is really crucial to having something, again, that's just enjoyable to work on. And even though oftentimes we try to make, as content creators, as teachers, as lecturers, we try to create our content in a very linear fashion where, for example, you're going to do all the modeling first, and then you're going to do all the shading and texturing, and then you're going to do the lighting, and then you're going to do the rendering. In reality, it doesn't really work like that for most people. And for me personally, I find that I'm constantly jumping around doing different things. So I don't think it's completely necessary to work in a linear form at all times. And that's, my segue to why we're jumping into something like lighting at this time. And I think lighting is a very crucial thing, to having something that's enjoyable to work on, keeps your enthusiasm up for the project. And it's a fun thing to sort of play around with. So yeah, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about lighting. Now, currently, I've deleted all my lights. I've turned off my window lights. I'm starting with a blank canvas. If I do a render right now, I'll get basically nothing but black. So just so you can see that I'm starting from scratch here. That's an old render. It'll refresh here in a second. There we go. So that's my current render. It's just nothing but black. So I have no lights turned on in my scene at the moment. So we want to light the scene. Now, oftentimes I'll suggest if you're new and you want some really quick, cool lighting that's going to look fairly realistic and you just want to get that really quickly, I'll oftentimes suggest using a Arnold physical sky. And this is found here in my mega shelf. It's also found in the Arnold tab over here on the right. So if I just create a physical sky, we'll basically get this big sphere looking thing in our scene. And usually this should be sort of like surrounding your whole scene. So I'll just grab my scale tool and scale that up. And if we just do a quick render here, we'll get some pretty good results right off the bat. It's going to mimic daylight. It's going to mimic actual physical sunlight. In this case, we're getting sort of like an evening setting, but that's looking pretty good. And in the settings here, we have some things that we can sort of mess around with. And you have this AI sky dome light shape. And this is just basically the same as your sky dome, but your physical sky settings are going to be in this AI sky dome. Or no, actually this AI physical sky here. So this is where all the settings for your light coming from the sun is going to be. So for example, you have elevation and azimuth. Now I always get these two mixed up. One of them is basically the time of day, right? So like if it's noon, the sun is directly 90 degrees from the ground. I believe that's what azimuth is. But again, I'm not completely sure. I get these mixed up all the time. But one of them will basically control the sun's position in the sky, right? And whether it's evening, night, and the other one, elevation, I believe, will basically control your location on the planet. So for example, the sun shining in Florida is going to look a lot different than the sun shining in Alaska because the sun's at a different angle to us. A lot of different factors there. So you can kind of just play around with these. And I see as I edit the azimuth, you see my shadow kind of going around. But we're not really changing the time of day, right? We're just changing the sort of angle of the light. So I think I have it backwards. I think azimuth may be like your location on the planet, or your latitude, so to speak. And then the elevation is the sort of time of day. So if I point this at 90 degrees, you'll see that my shadows are going straight down towards the ground. So this is basically noontime here. So if I change my azimuth, we'll get a little bit of a different quality of light. We can increase the intensity as well, brighten things up a little bit. The turbidity is basically like the sort of particles that are in the sky. So what we call participating particles, basically why mountains from far away will begin to look a little bit blue, because there's this turbidity, there's these particles in the sky. So that's what your turbidity is. But my point is basically that you can get some really cool results from just using this AI physical sky, right? And I often suggest students, if they just want some really quickly realistic lighting, to just use this. You know, this is great. This works great. It looks good. However, for what I want, I'm trying to do some very specific lighting. And even though this physical sky is very realistic, and it's physically accurate to like what sun is like, it's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a very stylized sort of look and lighting to my scene. So in my case, I don't really want to use my physical sky or my AI physical sky. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And we'll turn our render off here. And I'm just going to create a regular old Arnold area light. Now, just as we talked about before, I kind of want to turn off normalize. So that's something that I want to do right off the bat. I'll go ahead and hit 7 on my keyboard so we can kind of get an idea of where that light's going to come from there. I do want to kind of angle it. See, I like how in this example here, you have a little bit of a shadow casting on this side of the roof there. And I kind of want to get that look going on here. And this is what I would consider my main sort of key light in this situation. So whenever it comes to lighting, I always recommend that you do something, especially if you're doing something stylized, you want to do something eye-catching. I recommend that you do something creative. Don't just throw a physical sky in there. If you really want to wow people, be very creative. Try to be very creative about how you light something. Look at how photographers light scenes when they do these studio shots that, you know, where you see someone's face and half of their face is red, half of their face is blue. Very creative lighting. And at the end of the day, I feel like if you have creative lighting in your scene, good creative lighting, it's always going to look cooler, better than just throwing a physical sky or what's known as an high dynamic range or HDRI lighting in your scene. So yeah, we're going to bump the intensity on this up quite a bit. And I'm going to give this a slight blue, just a little bit of a blue hue. And I like to deal with just one light at a time. So I'm just going to have that one light in my scene, and we'll click render to see what that looks like. So intensity needs to go way up. Let's try something like 50. I think 100 might be a little too high. We're going to throw some other lights in here. So let's just stick with 50 for now for this one. Now I do want my shadows to be a bit sharper. So what I'm going to do is come down to my spread option here and just start dropping my spread down. And this should make, we can really see it right here, right? The lower my spread is, almost seems like the brighter my light gets, but the sharper my shadows get because it's sort of condensing that light. I'm actually going to change this light from a quad to a disc. And I'm going to make it bigger, but I'm also going to back it up quite a bit. And sort of like the further away it is, the more it's going to simulate like moonlight or sunlight. Because the shadows, it will definitely tell in the shadows, because you know your moon or sun's like thousands of miles away, right? It's not close up, so it's going to affect the way your shadows are cast. So give that a second to sort of kick in. So I'm liking that, maybe a little less spread and a little less intensity. Because this should be, for the most part, this is going to be like a night or twilight scene. I'm going to add a little bit more blue, maybe purplish hue to this scene. You never want to go too colorful with your colors. Definitely don't get too crazy with your colors. You definitely don't want anything fully saturated, right? If you just go with a fully saturated color, you get something like that. Not looking great. All right, I think I like that. Now this will be sort of like my my key light or my main light, and now we can perhaps add in a fill light. So I'm going to add in another Arnold area light. And this one I think I'm going to just do straight down. So we'll say like this over here is my moon. So this is where we're casting a lot of the light, the shadows. And we'll call this one my starry sky. So your stars are going to emit a little bit of light, and then your moon will emit quite a bit more, but your stars will kind of fill in the light a little bit. We'll turn off normalize. I'm again going to choose sort of like a cooler color for this. Increase our intensity, not a lot. And we'll have to tweak it when we get into our render. So let's see what that looks like when we render that. So this is nice because we're still seeing some of that shadow, right? And then we still see, and now we're seeing some of the more details here in our shingles and stuff. So we get that shadow casting, but we also still see some details in here, which is nice. Now again, if I want my shadows to be much sharper, I can drop my spread, right? And then that almost will like intensify that light quite a bit. So we'll have to find a happy medium between having sharp shadows and a high intensity. So I'll just sharpen those shadows a little bit, and then we'll drop our intensity maybe just down to 1, or let's try 2. We'll split the difference for now, do 1.5. And then I want to do another fill light, just sort of, since this is the main angle we're going to be looking at the house, very dim light just sort of pointing at the house here. So we'll create one more area light. And this one I want to be kind of over here pointing at this house. At an angle. Again, turn off normalize. And I want this to be fairly dim, so we're just going to look at it the way that it is with an intensity of 1 and see what that looks like. So we can try bumping up the intensity here a little bit to kind of fill out just some of the other details in your scene. Now, as a rule of thumb, if you're whatever you're lighting, you generally always want it to be a bit lighter than, you know, you sort of perceive it in your mind, because it's always easier to make things darker than to make something that's too dark lighter. If you try to take something that's too dark and you make it lighter in like Photoshop or post-production, it will tend to get very washed out. So you always want to make things lighter than you want it. And that way in post-production, you can make it darker if you need it to be darker. Now, as a rule of thumb, and this is an old painter thing too that a lot of painters use, is you never want to have any solid black or solid white in your scene. Now, in this case, we have lots of black in here because our background at the moment is black. We're going to change that eventually, but our background at the moment is black. So, but that's something you want to keep in mind. You never want to have any solid black or solid white in your scene. The reason is if you do want something to look bright, or if you do want something to look especially dark, it will look the most bright or the most dark if that's the only thing that's white in your scene or the only thing that's black in your scene. So your general scene should not have any black or white, pure black or white in it at all. You want only sort of like the hero elements, or if you want something to look really bright, like for example, my windows are going to be emitting a lot of light, so they may have some white in them, but nothing else in my scene should be purely white. Now, I like this so far. I do want to take this light up here, this big one that I have, and angle it a little bit more this way, so my shadow is a little bit more at sort of like a 45-degree angle. So something like that. Before, my shadow was just kind of jutting off right here. So now it's kind of at like a 45-degree angle. And this other light that I created, since my other two lights are blue or very cool, I'm going to give more of like a warm-ish tone to this light. So a little bit of like an orangish or yellowish tone. And that will just, you know, kind of makes it look like maybe there's a campfire over here, or maybe someone's walking up with a torch or a lantern, but it just gives it a little bit more ambiance. And once again, if I want to sharpen these shadows a little bit, so like I think maybe my main light here, the shadows should be a little bit sharper. So let's drop the spread a little bit. See, that doesn't like, the disc light doesn't like the spread too much. Let's try switching that back to a quad. I see what's happening. So the fact that we're changing this means that basically our light, we're basically not casting light right there. So we just need to adjust our angle a little bit and our size. And then we can switch that back to a disc. Yeah. So probably bump the intensity down just a tad more on that light. And remember, I'm going to have lights coming from my windows too. So I don't want to blast the light too much in all the other areas. And this light, I think I'm going to make it a little bit of a darker blue. And mess with the intensity a little bit. Again, I'm trying to get just enough light where we see the shadows we want to see and everything, but I don't want any sort of pure blacks in my scene. So I'm just trying to sort of find that fine balance between all of my lights to where we can see a little bit of everything. And I think overall that's looking pretty good. I really like the highlight that we get right here on our shingles. Later we can talk about something called light linking as well, where you can sort of make lights affect what you want them to affect and not affect other things. So I'm liking that though. My ground, of course, is a little washed out, but we'll definitely change the color of the ground. There will be other things there that will affect that. Okay, so we have sort of like basic lighting in the scene sussed out. I'm sort of happy with what we have there lighting wise. Now I want to talk about lighting in the windows because what I had before just wasn't really doing it for me. I didn't really like the result that was giving me. So what I ended up doing is using an area light instead of those windows. And let me show you the difference here. So this is a little render I did before where I have this area light. You can see that we have much nicer colors, richer colors here, and we have much nicer lighting coming from this window using this area light than what we had with just our window and the emissive cranked up on it. So I think what I'd like to do is replace all my windows with my window glass with area lights. And I did create this one a little bit in an interesting way. So I want to explain how I created this window. And we'll do that just by creating a new one. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on this other one that I created here. So it's currently hidden, so I'll just unhide it. And then you can see, we'll go ahead and unhide all of our windows as well, or we'll turn their emissive back up actually. So just so you can kind of see the difference. So I'll crank that emissive back up to, I think we had it at like 5, and do a quick render. So you can see that this light just, you get a lot more out of it, right? It's a bit of a richer color. It's not so grainy. The emissive attribute tends to make your highlights quite a bit grainy and things like that. So we don't want that. So I think instead what I'm going to do is use this area light instead. So what I did to create that, it's basically just an area light with a little bit of a texture on it. I want you to notice that, again, if I do a render here, actually, I'll explain it as we kind of move forward. So I'm just going to go ahead and select this one and delete it. And then I'll create a new area light. And we'll move it up. Scale that to size. We'll flip it around so it's pointing in the right direction. Gonna move that into position. Scale it to about the right size. And then I can just sort of move that back there behind those boards. And then I can make it emit some light. So by default, again, I'm going to turn off normalize. And we'll just do a render. So we'll just do this a little at a time so you can kind of see the difference every little setting makes. All right, so at the moment we don't see it really doing much of nothing. Now I can begin to increase the intensity and then we'll start to see it emitting some light. Let's bump it up to something like 50. But you'll notice that I don't really see the light itself. We're just seeing to the inside of the house. So to fix that, we basically need to turn the light visibility on. And that's under your visibility tab in your light. And it's this camera. So you'll notice that like the diffuse visibility, specular, subsurface scattering, indirect volume, those visibilities are all set to 1, but the camera is set to 0. So if we set this to 1, we will now see that light back there. Right? And then we can come in and we can change this to more of an orangish color. And then we're getting something a little bit more similar to what we have here, right? And from here, what I did is I wanted there to be a bit of a fall off, so a bit of a darker area around the outside of the window. And you can see that it's almost black right there, right? And that's something that I do need to work on. But basically what I did for that is I just put a ramp in here. So I just went to my color, click that little checker box, and I put in a ramp. So then that will turn white. If we look at the ramp itself, we'll see that a ramp is basically just a gradient, right? And if we move this up and down, right, we can kind of see that form that it's taking. Now what I did is I chose, instead of a V ramp, I chose a box ramp. So we can see the sort of effect that that's going to have, right? So now we have a dark spot in our window. I want sort of like the reverse of that. So I want my light spot to be here, my dark spot to be around the edge. I can set my interpolation here to smooth. And I'm going to change this color to more of that orangish color that we're looking for. And then I can just either leave this black or change it to another color, alter it a little bit. Right, that's looking pretty good. And I can even now just grab my window, so to speak, my light, and kind of scale that until we see that looking about the way we want it to look. So we have that little bit of a black tinge around the edge there. And if you wanted a little bit more, what we can do is just take another little color tick there, and then we can just change this one to, we'll select that orange and just maybe like a mid to dark orange, something like that. And then we can make this one a much brighter yellowish, whitish light. So now we get that nice sort of gradient happening in our light, and then we can maybe bump up the intensity even a little more. So we start to see some of that light coming out of there. Now I actually like this one a little bit more than the one that I created here. So I'm going to get rid of this one and just use this one that I created right there. Oops, I deleted the wrong thing. So there's a sort of like lazy way we can duplicate this one to use it all over the place. And then there's a smart way we can duplicate it. So we're going to talk about those. So I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to delete this light. And then I'm going to delete just all my window glasses because I'm just going to use this light here. So I could just select this light and duplicate it. And if I do that a lot, let me just show you what that's going to do. So if I just Control D to duplicate this and then move this over to the side, say I render this, right? And say I want to adjust that ramp. Actually, it doesn't even look like it's rendering. Let's see if we can. Yeah, see, it's not even rendering. So let's do this a little bit of a different way. See, the ramp isn't actually applied to it. That's why it didn't work. So we could duplicate it, and then what I'm going to do is just connect the same ramp to all of my lights. So so let's go ahead and just really quickly duplicate the light. And get that into position or close. I'm gonna get them in position first and then just sort of tweak them all individually. So I just want to get them close to the right size, right orientation. And I'm actually going to group my skylights here and name those skylights so I don't get confused about which lights are which. My scene's acting a bit laggy, so I'm going to go ahead and go to Edit, Delete All by Type History. That may have messed up my my mesh network there, so I just undid that. I don't want to do that. But what we can do is just select everything in our scene. And then I'm just going to shift deselect my repro mesh, my mesh repro mesh. Or actually, let's try that again. And then just control deselect my repro mesh. There we go. And then I'm going to delete by type history. If you delete all, it will delete history for everything in your scene. If you just do delete by type, it'll only delete history for what you have selected. So give that a second, and hopefully that makes my scene just a bit snappier. So we'll just do these lights for now. We won't worry about the other sides of the house with no lights because I just kind of want to get this done so I can show you how to do this. All right, so now what I can do instead of having one with a ramp where I have to sort of adjust them and making new ramps for all of them, I can basically just apply that same ramp to all of my lights. And the easiest way to do that is through the hypershade. So to open your hypershade, you're going to click this little shader ball right here. And this is what your hypershade looks like. So what I want to do here is select the first light that I created, and I want to graph that network. So that's this button right here. That's going to graph my input and output connections. So you'll see that there's my ramp here. Now I could bring my other shaders in here or my other lights in here and just kind of hook them all up to this. But there's an easier way to do it within my hypershade and within my attribute editor. I can basically now just go through and select all of these individual lights, starting with 8, right? And then I can go to the settings here, and now I can just middle mouse drag this ramp into my color. And I'm just going to do that for all of those lights that I've created so far. And that way I can just edit this one ramp and it will affect all of my lights. Okay, so now that one ramp is connected to all of my lights in my scene. And we'll do a little render, see what that looks like. So yeah, that looks much better. I like the overall look of these lights a lot better than what we had before. Now I do feel like we need to bump up their intensity quite a bit so we see more of that splash light happening around the house. So I may need to do that on an individual basis. So let's go and say we'll bump this one up to something like 250. All right, so now we're getting much more of that splash light there. Maybe even 300. Yeah, so now we're getting much more of that splash light there. And I like the shadow that the chimney there is creating. I think we may need to even go a little bit higher with these. So let's just try to double it, 600. But in short, this is just how you want to go about lighting your scene. Be creative with it. Don't just fall into that trap of using something like the physical sky, because that's what's accurate to the real world. You can light your scenes a little bit more creatively. Again, at the end of the day, as long as it looks good, it is good. So we want our scenes to look nice and sharp and dynamic, and yeah. So I think I'm liking that. Now there are other little things we can do to kind of trick our scene into having more splash light, and we may get into that a little bit later. But so far, I'm really liking the way this is turning out with our lighting. We got our rocks. Our lighting looks good. And we are ready to move forward.